next, I'm just going to introduce the project that Rachel and I are both part of. We both come from a learning project called Schumacher College. Some of you might have heard of it, some of you might not. Schumacher College was established in 1991, and it was located in Devon, the UK. And the idea was that it was a radical experiment in holistic learning. And the founders were looking at how do we bring head, heart, and hands learning together. And the first course run at the college was actually a course by James Lovelock on Gaia theory. So already a lot of the foundational work was looking at complexity and system theory. And that experiment has been continuing in that place for many, many years and has sort of been intending to break ground in the holistic education zone. And so that's just to locate who we are and where we come from. Yeah. I'm handing over to Rachel to continue talking a bit more about what we do.
Thank you so much, Georgie. So I had the adventure of arriving at Schumacher about 5 years ago. So with a little bit of that context in mind, and over this cycles of change, which of course is the overarching theme for this conference, Georgie and I have been thinking, firstly, it's probably worth talking about our different roles. So I've kind of arrived there through a teaching role, I took on a master's program. And Georgie, did you want to say what your role was when you were there, just briefly?
Yeah, sure. So from 2023, I joined the college as a master's student studying ecological design thinking, and have subsequently, that role has morphed into me being part of the team at the college. Yeah.
And I think that's a really interesting way to sort of think about shifting roles. And I wanted to just put a little kind of flag line in for the next 10 minutes. I'm going to talk about multi-temporal learning. My own background as an educator is I really started my kind of academic career teaching in creative arts. I was actually running a contemporary dance BA degree. And when I moved to Schumacher, it was movement still carried over into the title of the course. It was movement, mind, and ecology. But the shift was profound for me as an educator. So it was moving somehow from a creative arts approach and opening up into ecological thought, kind of coming into alignment with a lot of activist scholarship, and maybe a little shift more into environmental humanities, but of course bringing those intersections to life through my own artistic practice. A bigger shift possibly was learning, living and working within a kind of constant pulse of a learning community. And I just wanted to take in this context of the multi-temporal learning. I know there's many themes that have been kind of, fermenting across the last few days, and it feels longer than 2 days that we've been kind of in conversation here. But I came originally out of a sort of 20-year history of working with formal education, but in some ways embedded a sense of a learning or a lived kind of temporal learning quality. I don't know if anyone in the room is familiar with what we would have used in kind of more undergraduate curriculum, which is a reading week. And I always felt that reading weeks were a little bit like kind of snoozing weeks. When I was leading on the BA degree program, it was a very physical subject. And one of the things that really kind of came clear around week 6 is our students would get a kind of a burnout. And so we used to use sort of 3 R's. It was restorative, reflective, with a very small R around a reading in that week. So I came to Schumacher very quickly aware of this, not just a pedagogic shift, not just a sort of disciplinary shift, but also very much a kind of rhythmic shift in how I was sort of thinking about my modes of teaching, my modes of delivery. It also gave me a chance to think about the kind of difference of qualitative attention when you're working with students that are very much in an experiential and kind of lived, regulated rhythm through the course of the day. And I think actually, if you go one forward, Georgie, I think there's a sort of day in the life of. So sorry, the screen I've just realized is a little bit small, but I'm not really going to talk to this slide other than to say that in this low residency module sort of scenario, we would have students that would come in and they would live with us in the college. And essentially, that might mean that we start our teaching at 7 a.m. It could be a silent disco in the redwoods. It could be a yoga meditation. And we could be still with our students kind of right up into sort of the early hours of the late hours of the evening and sitting around the fire. So hours could be spent between practical seminars, just sitting and chatting or going for walks with students. And then also the actual sort of curve of learning was that you could be having a dinner conversation and still kind of digesting content that maybe was unpacked at a sort of 2 p.m. lecture. So essentially this kind of learning curve, I think the whole kind of economy of learning really shifted within this sort of shift of a learning landscape. Certain aspects within this lived experiential learning became very clear. So for example, how might the temperature of learning shift during the course of the day? What were, as Georgie started today with this lovely kind of seasonal expansion of maybe some of our more than human companions, and what changes over time, what changes over the course of a day, what changes from one season to another. So what kinds of shifts of attention happen across these learning landscapes? The traces of learning became much more embedded, and certainly the social dynamics of each cohort, my own master's as well as these sort of different surrounding master's programs, swiftly gelled. So there was a deep learning as well as a kind of a deep trust, I think, that was built within the groups. Our relationships to students as staff definitely became much more porous, perhaps less boundaried. And certainly from my own experience in developing and designing the first year of that master's program, the students really did feel like kind of co-pilots in that learning journey. So I've written, and I think maybe Georgie can put some things up on a chat line.
Welcome back, everyone. Hope you had some nice chats. We're not going to reflect on that right now, but there will be time at the end of the session for some questions and discussions. So if you can hold whatever might be interesting. So now I have this nicely provocative question up on the screen. While I was a student at the college, we started to realize that the place in which we were located didn't seem that it was going to hold us for much longer. So this question started to become quite alive in the community, a space where the land informs the pedagogy so much. What happens when that starts to go and when we no longer have access to our land? So what I'm going to talk about, and Rachel will expand on, we're going to talk about a few responses that the organization has had to this challenge. And the first is actually a response that came out of the student body. And as students during this time, we felt that we needed, in a way, to create something that could contain the spirit of the college beyond the four walls, as we felt that we weren't going to be in that building for much longer. So we started what's called the Schumacher magazine. And initially we started this project within the student body, just who was on site. We asked students to send us in content of what they were working on. But it was also an opportunity to mirror back to those at the time, the magic of the place, and to also mirror back to the wider alumni community, the story of this college and why it is so special to all of us and so important. We didn't realize at the time, though, that in a way, I think the most interesting thing that was happening with this project is that we were creating what we call a decentralized learning commons. We were creating our own pedagogy through making a magazine project. And that continued as we left the college and as the college left the physical place it was located on. So this last year now, as alumni, we've created another publication that's available to the public. And is bringing in our wider network from beyond that current student body, and is also telling tales of our alumni who are all over the world. And we see as a team that it's keeping our learning alive, but not only that, that it's actually allowing the whole network to continue learning from each other. And so we were quite excited about this project as being a way of the learning to continue in a physical form, even if it might not be with a building. So yeah, that's a project I wanted to share, and I'll share a link in the chat so you can explore that project a little bit more. And then I'm going to hand over to Rachel to chat more about some other ways in which we navigated this transition.
Thank you, Georgie. So as our students were getting busy with this decentralized sort of learning commons and really kind of picking up the flavor, the sentiment, I mean, there are many words we could use when we go through extreme change. But actually, I was just going to very quickly just read from an article that I started probably a few months later. I took to the road, as many other Schumacher staff. We sort of took on our nomadic form out in the world. And there's a little link that Georgie will share, which came from one of our colleagues at the time, Martin Shaw. And he proposed that we should just go caravan, and we should get out in the world, take our pedagogy with us, and have this, what I think a lot of us would describe as a kind of sense-making, place-making form of pedagogy, to sort of really flex that muscle out in different educational worlds, use our wonderful alumni, over 2,000 scattered all over the globe, our learning networks that have remained really kind of connected, and sort of orient ourselves as staff actually through that kind of constellation of activity. But to go back to the sort of pinch point, and in retrospect might be just worth describing. So when we were literally put on freeze, it was actually the beginning of a very bustling and chaotic start to the term. We had approximately 80 postgraduate students, many of whom had travelled from countries far and wide, invested savings, organised complex living arrangements, and fully embraced this new learning adventure. Schumacher is Ernst Schumacher, who is obviously our college kind of name, and his own seminal work, although it was written in 1950s, Small is Beautiful, whilst it was kind of perhaps written in an era, certainly an educational era, that was perhaps yet to gain feminist and decolonial insight, offers what remains a very pertinent socio-ecological critique for a kind of economic condition, and indeed an educational environment that might function at scale rather than speed, making things smaller and more simple. And certainly this year, in all its adaptations, has been a year where Schumacher College has been figuring our own scale, feeling our new form, finding the right fit. And Small Though Beautiful has perhaps never felt so vulnerable. So as our students were facing the prospect of kind of an imminently shifting and rapidly kind of changing learning landscape and developing initiatives such as the magazine, staff were very quick, colleagues were quick to adapt and to new tasks, co-delivering a swift and growing portfolio of short courses, workshops, public seminars, creative exchanges, and overseeing new developments in our own educational learning sites. So using the library, using the canteen, using the kitchen, and really kind of opening up to kind of bringing people in through things like public lunches, artist residencies, writer and research kind of residencies, and holding really important kind of platforms, whether it was for health workers or some of the bioregional growers. So we were pretty active in, despite the fact that we had these kind of very altered timelines, going back to this idea of the sort of multi-temporal pedagogic space. So we started talking at the top of this hour about this idea of a multi-temporal space, or a kind of lived pedagogy. And one of the very sort of logistical and urgent things that staff, particularly like myself, that had an MA that was only in its third year of kind of growing, and certainly had a lot of sort of expectant students that were hoping to sort of register on that program in 2024 and 25. So as we were into this effectively teach out period on our site, it did, funnily enough, afford us as academics, as tutors, as lecturers, to actually start to think about each other's areas, each other's practices more peripherally. And I will invite you just for a moment to just go ahead and take your eyes off the screen. This is, I'm going to share just with a very brief 2 little phrases. I'm going to also credit my colleague Valentin Gallier. He would probably argue that this was very much a kind of in the spirit of deep collaboration, and it was part of the co-design description of a new foundation program that would welcome 12 students from a kind of across the globe. The program itself took a slightly sort of shorter space. In fact, I'll just stop there, and I did say close your eyes, so go ahead and close your eyes, and I'm just going to read. This was in our introduction, inviting students to come with us on this new learning journey in the form of a transdisciplinary foundation course. So in this course, economics intertwines with poetry, ecological designs are woven with deep listening, walking redraws topographies, and philosophy learns and translates the songs of birds. This is a radical experiment in transdisciplinary education. We are crafting an experimental co-learning space where we will help each other to face the unknown, to dwell in processes of deep curiosity, imagining, questioning, and creating. Why do we want you to join the course? Because if we think that we are living in these times through something called a polycrisis, then our response must be polyvocal. We must learn to listen to speak to, and to cherish many voices. If ecocide is looming, it cannot merely be countered. It must be outfoxed by calling forth creative responses across all fields of knowledge, across ways of seeing, across kinds of making and modes of being. And I'm also going to just allow you to keep your eyes closed. And this was something that I shared with students. It was a bittersweet moment where students were kind of graduating. And again, I felt that they really were carrying quite a heavy weight in terms of sort of being placeholders of a heritage that had kind of gathered over 30 years of really active pedagogy, and yet not quite knowing what was going to be the college that was yet to be dreamed into. And I'm just going to share what I shared with them, just a short part from that on the day. So on this day of graduation, of becoming a master of, I would like to celebrate the mastery of the as yet unknown, or perhaps unknowable. To hold a kind of dispositional ethics of unknowing, committing to the journey that you started to digest through your master's program, and through the continuation of learning and unlearning by processes of rooting, baking, weaving, harvesting, spinning, etching, dancing, to unearth through what Timothy Morton might describe as a wiggle room, making space for maneuvering and reimagining existences in the face of polycrisis. There is a kind of simulacra that emerges from the synergies and recipes of these short learning cycles that we share together. Not always evident in this heavy mix of a low residency program as we merge through a cacophony of furtive and fast fused experimentation, not always fully formed, hopefully emerging, dissolving, slipping into other forms, translating into other spaces, and meeting and mingling with other voices. And this is perhaps the blessing and the responsibility of these short and powerful times we have spent together, our sun and skin burnt from scaling across abandoned copper mines up in Dartmoor, our bellies full of kimchi and sourdough, swapping ingredients and fermentation techniques from Malaysia, Japan, Portugal, Brazil, Armenia, our feet wet from slipping into the dark river to bathe our throbbing bones, keeping up with Satisha's walking pace. linking our forest trails with our food preparation, with the organisms of soil, with plants, with animals, with bacteria and fungi. This quick medicine, these activation pools that we dip and bathe in this past year and beyond, continue to bubble and ferment. As Bayo Akamalafe says, we must pierce through the membranes of the familiar, of the approved. Only by losing our coordinates and getting generously lost can our hope for new landscapes, which lie not in the center of the circle to which everyone had turned, but beyond its circumference, in the wilds and beyond our own fences. So, bringing you back then into the room, I think we probably don't have time to talk about all the activities that our sort of staff have kind of undertaken. But what we would love to do is just to share a little bit. We're moving towards the end of 3 points that we'd really like to share and kind of translate out into the space. But it is in this chapter of kind of nomadism, and I do really encourage you to listen to Martin Shaw. It's a beautiful about 8-minute podcast that we shared earlier. What was essentially happening was that it afforded us insight and exchange with kinds of temperatures of education, with cycles of education that are dealing with completely different social, economic, cultural sort of conditions of learning. So I think I won't talk too much about sort of some of those nomadic chapters. You can follow them again if you look on our website. But I'm just wondering, Georgie, do we have time to think about what we would take on the road in terms of our teaching?
Yeah.
I feel we do. Okay, so I'm going to ask everyone how you're all doing in a moment, but we are going to just put you back in some breakout rooms. And Georgie has given some really lovely examples here of what you might take with you on a nomadic learning journey. And I think for me, I know I have to have a whistle. Any teaching I'm doing needs to have a whistle. I need a bell. I need blindfolds. I need torches. I need drawing materials. These are things that I absolutely have as a kind of time traveling kit of learning. So again, we're going to, if it's okay, Eve, if we could take maybe just a slightly shorter time. We'll go for 3 minutes, I think, if that's okay.
Yes, we want to do different groups of the breakout rooms.
If it's possible to scramble the groups, that would be wonderful.
I have the same groups. The same
well,
group?
Maybe it's also nice to return. Let's say we return if it's easier for you.
Yes.
Some people have joined with us. We'll put you together also.
Yes. Assign and then shorter, 4 minutes.
Yeah, even 3. But okay. But I hope it's clear. Please feel free to just.
Has anyone questions about the exercise, or are you all okay and we can just give it a try?
And we will put these on your chat line as well. There was a request to do that.
Yeah.
So kind of what you would take in a sort of backpacking pedagogy. What would you take with you on a learning journey? And again, if you can't think for yourself, what might you like someone else to take for you if you were kind of going on that learning journey? I'm going to hand back to Georgia. I just wanted to just kind of maybe just share with you that these kinds of short courses, the foundation program, which was the longer arc program that was dreamt up in that chapter, and also some of these kind of shorter courses. Really, I think this was about repurposing an educational space that had somehow lost its kind of longevity and identity as an educational space, but also places like the foundation with this slight nomadism allowed us to actually really kind of reach out to many of our bioregional partners. As Georgie mentioned at the beginning, we're based in South Devon, and we have over the years really established a very kind of site responsive practice. So we couldn't take our Schumacher pedagogy, away from places like the Dart River or Dartmoor itself. And so in repurposing these learning spaces, also this kind of packing of our pedagogy on the road. These were kinds of short recipes, and I think they have kept us alive as a learning community. Even though perhaps our students who came with us into these slightly nomadic spaces didn't feel the pulse of the learning that I described to you earlier. They weren't surrounded by those kind of wider communities of practice. They didn't get to interact, for example, with our volunteers, with the cooks, with the gardeners, all of the other communities of practice that have made up the kind of radical host space that Schumacher was, is, and will still become. So I'll hand over to Georgie, and just thinking about those kinds of wider ripples and resonances that have kind of come with us out into the world. And for me, this nomadic form essentially has allowed us to really kind of distill the ingredients of a Schumacher pedagogy. So thanks, Georgie.
Cool. Yeah, so well, the one thing to talk about is that we also took these experiments into the urban. It was a really interesting time to kind of cross that rural urban threshold that we'd been operating in the rural for so long. And we also used the opportunity to make new friends. This was a course we ran, a short course we ran in London. And we were so curious to see how popular it was actually. And so I do think we are often asking people to come out to the rural, to us, and what would happen if we went into the urban, and what do we have to learn from the urban spaces. So this is, I call it urban experiments because these experiments continue, and we have a bunch of programming happening in London this year. We'll share some links to those, and we're announcing a few more in the coming weeks. But then also wider field, some interesting things happened that weren't, these are all gatherings within our network that happened that weren't initiated by the core staff at Schumacher. So the one was a graduation because our year didn't have a formal graduation. However, we had probably one of the most Schumacher style graduations there ever were, and was completely co-created by the students who invited the faculty to join the graduation. And in the middle, we have people who are part of the Schumacher community who live in and around South Devon gathering over Christmas, this last Christmas. And some of those artworks on the wall were artworks that traveled from our original building into this lovely home. And then lastly, this is an alumni gathering that happened more recently in South Africa. And these are just a few of many gatherings that have been happening throughout our network, and some of which have been really catalyzed by this movement. And lastly, to just give you an example of that, is this map shows a bunch of our alumni and alumni offshoot projects that are other educational projects that have started all over the planet over the last 30 years. And in a way, for me, sometimes I think the students who left the college kind of have already mastered nomadism, and it's now for the college itself to master that and to bring with it all these interesting questions that it's learned on this interesting journey. And we're very curious about what all these questions and these new relationships have created, and what that means for when we find ourselves in a new place, and how that will evolve in our cycle of change, a new pedagogy or a transformed pedagogy. Yeah. So, Rachel, do you want to open up for
Yeah,
conversation?
I want to open up, but could we, because we flashed through one slide there, which is just, we're talking a
Yeah.
lot about multi-temporal education. And actually, I thought it was just interesting to share with you, I think it's one back or even two back, one more, the image from Rex Gardner. So just very briefly, I wanted to just make sure we looked at this image together. This was an image that was designed from one of the estate craft workers, the same estate that housed Schumacher for 30 years, and actually had another educational chapter in the form of a College of Arts, experimental College of Arts. It was there from 71 until 2014. One of the things that personally I have done since I'm working still with Schumacher, but I've also kind of have a another hat where I'm working as part of Waldorf Learning Foundation, which means I'm educating educators who are working with much younger learning communities. And through that post, I actually came across and was contacted by someone called Dr. Sharon Clancy. Clancy is, associate professor at the University of Nottingham, and she's developing a program at the moment called Lost Spaces and Untold Stories, the Vanishing World of Experimental Adult Education. So places like Dartington, again, I'm sorry to be a little bit culturally specific, I'm staying within a kind of British reference here, but Bretton Hall, which is in Leeds in northern England, Trent Park in North London, which used to be the Middlesex Polytechnic and became Middlesex University. So after World War II, there was over 40 different educational sort of very progressive educational spaces that opened for adults in this country. And I think it's really interesting that there's a sort of held timeline going back to the multi-temporal, that many of them had shortened chapters, probably about 30 years. But we're also very progressive and accessible education for adults. And I think it's interesting to share where actually these aims, these pedagogic aims that could be anything from organic farming, ecological, environmental kind of based education, political history, local history, industrial archaeology, crafts, sort of alongside technological kind of innovations, maybe within farming, alongside furniture design, alongside the performing arts. So, you know, I want to just leave, and we'll go on to these kind of prompts that we've given you to discuss. But I think just responding to the cycles of change, it's always interesting to arrive and look 100 years back and think, what were the educational visions that were really held, that were very much kind of supporting a holistic educational field. Okay. So we'll scooch on to the final prompts, and I think this is just our opportunity to open up. We feel like we've kind of held the space and maybe talked at you a lot by now. But when Georgie and I started to talk about this event, we really had three kind of punchlines that we very quickly wanted to address together. So maybe if you just go to the last slide, Georgie, and we can just open, or we could even put it on the chat line, whichever is easiest.
Here we go.
Brilliant. The one up. Yeah. Okay. So I think we'll kind of round up with maybe just leaving these prompts for us to think about. I'm just going to put them on the background chat as we're there. And essentially, hopefully they speak a little bit to the sort of where we've traveled with you this evening, thinking about kind of Schumacher out in the world, thinking about this notion of multi-temporal educational systems. I think you had a lovely term, Georgie, of from whence does your pedagogy come? So again, this sense of sense making and place making in the world, how can we then bring that back to design or kind of re-articulate future curricula? And then this sense of heritage and learning sitting in these places of maybe sort of slightly shorter lived chapters of educational fields, what can be kept over from the sort of heritage of these learning practices, and how we shift some of the value systems into these ethics of learning and participation. I'll go ahead and put those in the background, but if you want to maybe just, yeah, we've only technically with 3 minutes, and some of you may absolutely need to leave on the kind of of the hour, but I think we'll probably end up going just a few minutes over, if that's okay. So we'll just
it's safe with everyone. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Eve.
There was also a question, what was the adult education space called?
So it's an adult education project called Lost Spaces, Untold Stories, the Vanishing World of Experimental Adult Education. And that's with Dr. Sharon Clancy, who's an associate professor at the University of Nottingham. It's actually a Labour-Home grant that is only for 1 year. I think she has to draw down the project in September this year. And so we have had a couple of really interesting conversations about kind of looking at maybe hopefully what will not be forgotten education spaces, but looking at the actual physical spaces that were inhabited. And especially in the UK, a lot of those were actually coming from stately homes of former education, or that were kind of, had maybe even former aristocracy, but were very much repurposed and provided a safe space for this very kind of innovative education programs, many of which don't exist anymore.
Do we have someone else with questions? You can unmute yourself and ask or put it in the chat. Maybe some thoughts on about the breakout room talks you had with each other.
Yeah, Georgie, maybe if we just open up to the room, and I will try and find those questions and put them on the chat line so that we can kind of see if anyone wants to share.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you shared the screen last time when we went to the breakup group. What would you take with you on a nomadic experience? Can you share with us the top 3 things that you have seen taking away from a nomadic experience? What would be the top 3 things?
Oh, brilliant question.
Very good question.
Yes. I guess for me, a sense of time poverty. I'm very aware that in my own education that my lecturers, my tutors must have had time to sit and discuss. I'm also aware of the gift of time that came out of those very difficult circumstances where we didn't have an expectation of the next sort of module and the next kind of cohort of students coming in the door. So I think perhaps linked to nomadism is a sense that we don't always have, there's a time restriction on how we even generate our pedagogies. That would be one.
I have one.
Yeah.
It's something to do with intimacy or of place. When you're nomadic, you maybe haven't seen a full seasonal cycle of a place. You maybe don't know the plants, and that is something that is missing in a nomadic. It's quite a good thing if you're nomadic to make friends with people who are intimate with the place. I think that's something interesting to consider. So even if you yourself are not, you might find someone who is. Yeah.
Very nice.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think this is an experience that everyone should have at least one time in their lives, like the nomadic experience, let's say?
Well, it's interesting because I'm also living nomadically at the moment, so I'm experiencing it on many levels. I don't know if I would say everyone should have it, but in my personal experience, I have learned lessons that I wouldn't be able to learn, and I can't imagine other ways I would be able to learn those lessons. They're very unique lessons. Yeah.
I think so too. I've lived nomadic for 6 months, so I was like, wow, why I didn't did this before when I was younger. And if I could do my school over again, I would choose for one school like yours, you know. It's really a really life-changing experience for me, at least it has been. So is there anyone else with questions in the room? Let me check the chat. I resonate with that. Like people, a lot of places prefer time to get to know one another before intimacy. Jose Bosque. Lerna says, I believe nomadic education has a potential to develop our flexibility, resilience, and problem-solving skills, besides creating various levels of learning experience. Nikita, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. As someone that's part of the very formal system as well and is studying higher education, and interested in curriculum. I'm just trying to understand, are there other, pedagogies of transdisciplinary learning that also work? Like, I'm just, this experience, yes, but I really loved the reading that you did or the example that you shared, right? So how does one engage in depth with disciplines and switch around? Is there a guide? And I also love the quote that you shared at the beginning, which mentioned a guide. So I also want to understand the role of the facilitator or the teacher in this entire process, and really just the depth of disciplines and the switching around. And I don't know, just maybe a little more about transdisciplinary, and what that, what defines that.
Great. I'm happy to respond. Thank you, Nikita. I think what Schumacher has gone as a small chapter of education, has gone through different kind of educational provision and offers. So it became our own accreditation that came in the last 10 years. And when I joined, it was a growing portfolio of both transdisciplinary master's programs, but we also had a BSc in regenerative food and farming. And then we had these sort of shorter ARC programs. Some of those, as Georgie said, were kind of seasonal. So we had a biorhythmic calendar where growers would join a program in April and finish in sort of August. So we'd go through that sort of seasonal calendar. But actually, in terms of the sort of transdisciplinary aspect, I feel like that was perhaps one of the signatures that came out as a founding holistic science center and dealing with sort of complexity and systems complexity learning, that really, I think, what was starting to come through in the creative signature of those courses was a need for transdisciplinary learning. I was very aware as a staff teaching on a transdisciplinary program, designing the curriculum. I had a very, very wide demographic of learners. So I might have someone coming on my own program who's coming from an outdoor educational lens. I might have someone that's coming from a creative arts background that's maybe wanting to develop new kind of platforms for expanding the audience. I might have someone who's developing as a grower or permaculture practitioner. So already the challenge in the programs was to look at the sort of scholarly fields and look at those sort of intersections and start to think about how we could bring those critical conversations into alignment for students. I think going back to the beginning of your question in terms of sort of nomadism and the role of the tutor, we have certainly, we've had to adapt our roles because our roles sort of shifted from being in a formal educational kind of relationship to students to having to diversify and run short courses and sort of think about other ways to kind of curate and design alternate learning programs. So it is, even though, for example, I absolutely entered in the role of program lead for a master's, I very quickly sort of diversified within that. And then something Georgie just mentioned at the end is actually in terms of this last sort of lived landscape, very experimental lived landscape of kind of interacting with learning communities in different education systems. So my colleagues and I spent a month in Japan earlier this year. We were working both in kind of independent learning cycles, so in permaculture sites with regenerative educators who are trying to do very, very different kinds of programs. And we were also working with, for example, Musashino University that's just developed its first well-being degree program. So it has been in some ways an affordance as an educator not to be within one kind of rigid setting as, in terms of the kind of directing just one program. But the question is how we then take that learning and take that kind of experience and take that exchange of information back into what will become a future curriculum. So it is a sort of watch this space in response to the latter part of your question. There was other parts of your question. I'm not sure I fully responded.
No, I think this really helped. Thank you. Can you repeat the name of the university with the well-being education program?
Oh, Musashino. I'll put it on the
Thank you.
really, really interesting program. It's only about 2 years, and it's yeah, some really, really interesting programs. And again, some of the students came to one of the short courses in Schumacher, and then Schumacher staff were kind of over in that direction later on in the year. So there was a nice sense of continuation.
Thank you.
Okay. Andre, thank you so much for sharing this amazing drawing. I'm going to share it with the rest of the team. I love it so much.
Beautiful, yeah, yeah.